Dr. Annelle Rodriguez Sheline, now regular guest on the show because she's so good and because she's so popular. She's a former State Department and research fellow of the Middle East at the Quincy Institute. A woman of many parts and a woman who knows her stuff and can talk cogently about them. Dr. Annelle, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Good to see you again. Hard to know where to start. Let's start with Greenland. Are you going to war with the 5 Italians, 15 French and 1 Englishman who are the last remaining elements in the defense force of Greenland, Germany having pulled its 15 soldiers out? I mean, even Rorke's Drift had, in the film Zulu, had more defenders than Greenland has. I mean, is Trump really going to do this?
It's very hard to say. I do worry that, as other people have noted, Trump seems to be high on his own supply in terms of what he perceives as the successful kidnapping of Maduro and his wife from Venezuela. Similar previous military actions that he had conducted, for example, in his first term, the killing of Qasem Soleimani in early 2020 in Iran. Both of these are instances where he used military force illegally to complete an objective, and as a result, thus far at least, has not had to face significant consequences. And so I worry that Trump thinks that he could do something like take Greenland and face zero consequences.
Well, he may be right, of course. I mean, the bully doesn't stop until he's stopped. And nobody yet has stopped him. He killed Soleimani in the first term. He has kidnapped Maduro and his wife. He has butchered Gaza, put Tony Blair back in charge of it. Imagine that. He has bombed the Iranians. He has effectively cowed all of his adversaries except Russia and except China on the economic level. So are we seeing now the foundations or the architecture of what will be the new world order, that the rest will be America's and the hinterland, the near abroad of Russia will be Russia's, and the Southeast Asian theater will be China's? Is that what we're seeing now, a kind of Orwellian Eurasia, Oceania, and so on? Is that what's now, even if Trump doesn't know that he's doing exactly that, what is actually happening?
I mean, I know that that is how some interpret this idea of kind of the Franklin Roosevelt spheres of influence idea, that you'd have the United States controlling the Western Hemisphere and other great powers controlling their various regions. But if you look at the national security strategy, for example, the language he uses does not in any way indicate that he's going to allow China to sort of operate within its own sphere of influence in East Asia. It maintains this idea that the United States has a right to military primacy, that the America's presence in East Asia is absolutely fundamental to U.S. security, and that will continue. So I'm fairly skeptical of those who perceive what Trump is doing now with this more aggressive approach to the Western Hemisphere as signaling that he will somehow be less aggressive elsewhere.
Well, let's take them country by country, or region by region at least. He certainly has succeeded in Venezuela. He has kidnapped the president and his wife. He has terrorized. He has extorted hundreds of millions from Venezuelans, from Venezuela's now government, the successor government, if you like, to Nicolas Maduro, 500 millions of which is sitting apparently in a private bank account in Qatar. And of course, good luck to ever seeing anything of that money. Of course, the words of defiance are still spoken from Caracas. but the actions are the opposite of defiance. Venezuela has clearly cut a deal with the devil to avoid being Libyanized, to avoid being torn apart. That's what's happened, isn't it?
Certainly. And this, as I was saying, Trump sort of interprets as a success that he was able to go in and kidnap Maduro and has thus far faced very few repercussions other than think pieces bemoaning the end of the international order, which they're not wrong about that. But as far as the any consequences that Trump has faced. Although I do think, for example, shifting back to the Middle East, which is my area of focus, I do think that even if we're not seeing countries that are overtly making moves against the United States, which is obviously the strongest military power in the world by a factor of, I think our military, I think, is stronger than the next 11 countries combined. So it is understandable that we're not seeing countries that are willing to take on not only the might of the US military, but in the hands of someone like Trump. But when you look, for example, at the behavior of Saudi Arabia in Yemen, pushing back against this incursion by these Emirati-backed forces that in early December had seized much of the former South Yemen, and then we saw those forces all being pushed back by the Saudi-backed forces, who have now consolidated their control of southern Yemen and at Saudi Arabia's insistence, as well as through the sort of the internationally recognized government in Yemen, insisted that the Emirati-backed force known as the Southern Transitional Council, or the STC, that they had to disband themselves, and the leader of that fled to Abu Dhabi. And so this was part of a broader project by the UAE along with Israel, which was trying to work in various strategic environments, including in southern Yemen, including in Sudan, Somalia, Somaliland, the Horn of Africa, to try to consolidate strategic territory and also to push back against Islamist governments or any government that the UAE and Israel saw as being hostile or opposed to it. And so what's interesting is now you have, I think the UAE probably thought that it would be permitted to do whatever it wanted because it's aligned with Israel. Whereas in contrast, you have Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Oman, Turkey certainly gathering together and saying, no, we are not interested in a regional order where the UAE and Israel are allowed to destabilize governments at will and sort of reshape, move fast and break things, reshape the regional order in the way that they see fit. So although this is not directly pushing back against Donald Trump, I do think that you will see mid-level powers in other parts of the world that will continue to pursue their own interests and will not simply sit back and allow something like what we saw taking place in Yemen. Unfortunately, what's happening in Sudan continues to be horrific atrocities backed by both Saudi Arabia on one side and the UAE on the other.
Let's segue then into the main reason why we asked you on, though your international purview is vast. And that is I think it's farcical. You may think it could work. I mean, we have a board of peace, most of whom are rich and Jewish, who have been established by Donald Trump as the new governors of Gaza. And of course, for us on the British side of the ocean, we cannot take our eyes off the fact that the man who should be in prison, Tony Blair, is now one of the governors of Gaza. What do you make of all this and its prospect of success?
Well, I do think that when the news got out that Trump wants nations to pay $1 billion in order to stay on his peace board, and that very quickly got a lot of pushback. I think the idea being that they could join, but then if they wanted to stay on the board, they had to pay $1 billion each. And that the concern there was that it seemed that Trump was perhaps trying to install his own version of an alternate United Nations that he would control, and that also he would control this vast amount of theoretical money, although thus far no entity, to my knowledge, has been willing to put up $1 billion of its own dollars in order to join this club. But to your point about Tony Blair, obviously it is extremely alarming. And sorry, I should clarify. So the group of nations, or what Trump was wanting countries to contribute to, was the sort of broader board of peace, for I think, again, kind of seen as this like world entity. And I think he'd invited people like Argentina's Javier Milei. I think Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney was invited. I believe Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt. And that is in contrast to the Gaza Board of Peace, I believe. That was the intention there, is to rebuild Gaza, that Blair is part of. It has, I'm just trying to look here to kind of clarify if these are the same. I mean, this is all sort of, it's only just coming, or this has only been recently announced. And so there's also the announcement of a separate 15-member Palestinian Technocratic Committee. And then there's the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. And there are certainly international figures from the UN that have been named to be part of this National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, such as Nikolai Mladenov, who's a Bulgarian politician and former UN Middle East envoy. But I mean, the takeaway, certainly from the inclusion of Tony Blair, as well as these other individuals from Jared Kushner to Steve Witkoff participating, is this seems largely like just another opportunity for Trump to try to accrue more wealth to himself. And similar to the funds from Venezuela that are now in a Qatari bank account, as you mentioned, I am extremely skeptical that any of this would ever go to the people of Gaza or to Palestinians, and instead this would merely line the pockets of Trump and his family.
Well, you say the people of Gaza, Doctor, but does all of this not presuppose that there will be no people of Gaza, that somehow they will no longer be there? Because how are these panjandrums and ghost figures and countries, how are they going to administer Gaza? With whose army? How many divisions does Jared Kushner control? How many American soldiers are going to be put into the maw in the Gaza Strip? We've seen the turnout of the armed forces in Greenland. Frankly, if you ask the public in most countries, do you want to send your soldiers into the Gaza Strip? Most of them would throw their hands up in horror. So unless there's power behind this, then the people will have to be removed, won't they? And to where and how can they be removed or be persuaded to remove themselves?
To your final point, my sense is that Israel continues to try to persuade them to remove themselves by not allowing in aid, not allowing any sort of permanent shelter. You know, the number of children and even adults perhaps who have died of exposure or hypothermia as a result of not having any sort of adequate shelter at a time when I read there were 80-mile-per-hour winds in Gaza. I mean, it's a horrific winter. It's January. I'm really horrified that following the announcement of the so-called ceasefire deal, or the 20-point plan in early October, that the world's attention really has shifted so far away from Gaza, and especially the mainstream media continuing to refer to it as a ceasefire. And you look at how many people have been killed. It's an average of one child each day. That's only the children. That's not including adults. In contrast, you think about the ongoing awful violence in Ukraine. However, just looking at the scale of it, acknowledging that there is still a war happening, that there are still casualties on both sides in Ukraine. And in contrast, there's allegedly a ceasefire in Gaza, despite again, these ongoing airstrikes and continuing refusal by Israel to adhere to phase one, so-called phase one of the plan, which was supposed to bring in 600 trucks of aid every single day, allowing in these, just the basics necessary for life. So to get back to your questions, I fear that in the very likely event that we do not see an international stabilization force materialize, as you said, what country would want to send its own soldiers to fight and die and occupy Gaza? The various Muslim majority countries that Trump initially crowed that were involved with the announcement of this plan, places like Turkey and Malaysia, none of these countries have been willing to contribute troops to this scheme, because it is very clear that it is not, in fact, a peace plan. It is a plan for the ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. So my fear is that instead we'll see Israel simply being allowed to continue its military campaign, and that will also have American contractors, military contractors. As you said, it's unlikely that Trump would put U.S. service members or troops, actual troops on the ground, and instead will pay vastly more money, vastly more in terms of U.S. taxpayer dollars, to pay American military contractors.
Well, quite. I mean, we were just the other day in Malaysia. I was discussing with members of the Malaysian government, high-ranking members. I mean, they were prepared to send soldiers, but of course Israel doesn't want that kind of soldier. They don't want soldiers from countries like Malaysia that are supportive of the Palestinian cause, because those soldiers would quickly become a potential problem, like the peacekeepers used to be regularly in Lebanon, a problem for Israel. So they won't accept Turkish soldiers. Netanyahu already said that. The fear of Muslim armies coming into Gaza is that this will be, if you like, a Trojan horse for the Palestinians. So I think they're doomed to an army of highly paid mercenaries, and we know where that kind of thing ends. We saw it in the mercenaries who were distributing the aid and killing dozens of people every day in the food queues. So it just seems to me that Trump is building castles in the air here that will never actually come to pass. And meanwhile, the Palestinian agony will continue.
Certainly. And as you said, those military contractors that were involved in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which itself is now defunct, but many of those same people are redeployed and are operating now near Gaza in preparation for whatever this next phase is going to be. On the one hand, while obviously we, as you said, we saw the outcome of what having American mercenaries in charge of humanitarian aid distribution, the bloody outcomes that produced. On the other hand, I hope that could, in between two bad outcomes, I think I would rather have the United States maintaining some involvement, as opposed to Trump just throwing up his hands and telling Israel to do whatever they want, because we know what that looks like. So although, again, these are not great outcomes at all, and I certainly agree with you that this initial idea that we might have various Muslim countries around the world that would send soldiers to provide this stabilization force, although not ideal, we did have the UN Security Council vote to authorize something like this, because I think it was hoped that that would be preferable, to have something like a version of UN peacekeepers coming in to protect Palestinians from Israeli brutality. And instead, I do worry that as countries take these steps back and they don't want to be involved in occupation, obviously, the alternative is simply Israel continues the genocide. And at some point, I fear that we'll shift from this sort of slow genocide as a result of exposure and inadequate nutrition, and return to the very fast and active genocide of Israel bombing everything it can and simply killing as many Palestinians as it can. And And as we've already seen, we know the world is not going to do anything to stop it.
Now, finally, Doctor, and I'm grateful for your time, and as someone formerly in government until you took a principled stand and left it, the obvious intention to attack Iran was there last week. You don't move all these military assets. You don't make the kind of maneuvers that were made if it is not at least in your plan to launch another attack. It never happened. And some say that Netanyahu, through Putin, asked that it should not happen because Israel was not ready to deal with the inevitable Iranian response. What's your take on the current state of affairs between the US, Israel, and Iran?
I'm skeptical that it would have been Netanyahu who asked that the US not intervene, because Netanyahu has been pushing for the United States to fight Iran on Israel's behalf for decades. And on my understanding of what Netanyahu asked for when he came to visit Trump at the end of December was reiterating not that they needed to go after the nuclear facilities, because again, those were bombed and it is unclear what survives after that, but to go after the missile facilities. But that's different. It's harder to hit the missile facilities. You can move them around. And then in fact that the outbreak of these mass protests in Iran may have actually delayed that outcome, that a decision had been made. The United States wanted to get out ahead, that apparently Trump didn't like that in June when he attacked Iran, it was seen more as kind of Israel's victory, such as it was. And he wanted to be out in front this time. And so my sense of who would have been the actors reining him in, I imagine it's people like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, who is really trying to focus on Vision 2030 because he has bet his crown on it, on this economic transformation that he has promised his people. And other GCC countries, like whether it's Qatar, the UAE, I think, is probably more in keeping with whatever Israel wants. But you think about how much money the Saudis, the Qataris, you think of the massive jet the Qataris gave to Trump when he visited last May. They've paid a lot in bribes to try to get the outcomes they want. And so I could imagine when there was all this posturing that the United States seemed to be about to attack, that you had MBS or Amir Tamim or other Kuwaiti or Omani leaders, also Turkey perhaps, coming in and saying, look, this would be terrible for the region. There was also reporting from the Wall Street Journal that apparently someone clarified to Trump that even if he did bomb, it was not clear that that would lead to collapse of the regime, which seems like an obvious thing that he should have known, but that perhaps also swayed him. So I'm skeptical of anyone who says they think it was Netanyahu reining Trump in, because I'm fairly certain Netanyahu has been wanting this for quite a long time.